Good day. Well, the end in Afghanistan has come quickly, as from time to time the end tends to do. In fact, events have worked out so rapidly over the last 48 hours that, as certain people pointed out in the thread of my last video, parts of it were already overtaken by events by the time it was posted. I do expect things to slow down a little from now on, because it's quite clear that the fighting is now over, with the Taliban in complete control of the entire city of Kabul. They've occupied all the important buildings, they've taken over and been photographed, or have photographed themselves, parading around the presidential palace. And it seems that there has been no effective resistance to this takeover from the Afghan army or security forces, which have vanished into the air or the mist. It's completely unclear who is now in charge in Kabul, or whether Afghanistan even has any type of government. The embassies around the world, the Afghan embassies around the world, are completely unaware of any instructions, it seems, being coming from Kabul. There are no diplomatic representatives, and as of the time of the making of this program, the Taliban have yet to announce who is in charge in Kabul, or what kind of government is being formed there, or who is in general control of the overall administration. President Ghani himself fled the country on Sunday without apparently informing the other ministers or even some of the officials of his office. This after giving a defiant address on Afghan television in which he said that he would not resign. Apparently he has now done so, creating the political vacuum which exists at the moment, though it was one which will be, no doubt, very quickly filled as soon as the Taliban leadership arrives in Kabul from Quetta, the town of Quetta, where they're based in Pakistan, or from wherever else some of their members may be. Apparently there's to be no transitional government, and frankly there doesn't seem to be any point in one, given that the government which existed previously and which the United States spent trillions of dollars and 20 years backing has now collapsed like a cake. So there we go. That is the situation in Kabul. At least for the moment, the Taliban fighters on the ground appear to be behaving with a certain degree of discipline, and there's been no reports of any great massacres or violence in the city. But of course, these are early days, and we have to wait and see what kind of government or regime is eventually established by the Taliban there. As I said in my previous program, nobody should be any doubt at the moment that it will be the Taliban themselves who will make these decisions, and that others may have some influence over them, but they no longer have any control over the situation, and the decisions will be made by the Taliban and by them alone. However, the diplomatic activity continues, and I will come to that shortly. At the same time as the Taliban are firmly in control of Kabul, and indeed, as far as I can make out, of the entirety of Afghanistan, one place remains outside their control, and that is Kabul Airport, or Hamid Karzai Airport, as it was renamed after the first president that was established in Afghanistan, essentially by the United States, when the Taliban lost power in 2001. I doubt that it will be Hamid Karzai Airport for much longer, and as for Karzai himself, I gather that he's in comfortable exile somewhere already. But anyway, let's not waste more time with him. The United States rushed troops and aircraft to the airport, and they appear to have it under control. but stories are, and film footage is seeping through of chaotic scenes there as thousands of people flee Kabul to the airport, passing by Taliban roadblocks. Apparently, the Taliban at the moment are allowing them to leave as they flee to the airport and trying to board planes, aircraft that are ferrying these unhappy people out. And we've heard some really distressing scenes of people being fired at by American troops as they try to impose some kind of order on what is looking like an extremely disorderly evacuation. And there's even been some stories, which of course I can't corroborate or verify, that some people have fallen to their deaths as they have tried to cling on to aircraft, American aircraft, as these try to take off, and with no doubt full of people, and people who've been trying to leave on those aircraft but were unable to board them, tried to cling on. Well, I should say that one should take those kind of stories with some degree of skepticism until they're corroborated. They're the kind of stories that circulate over the course of events like these, and we mustn't assume that they are necessarily true until we're able to obtain firm corroboration of them. But that some people have indeed died in shooting incidents in Kabul airport, that appears to be indisputable. It's not clear, by the way, how many thousands of people are actually there. And we do know that the United States has rushed 6,000 troops to Kabul airport to secure the airport and to take control as the evacuation is carried out. Now, I would say that the fact that people are able to come to Kabul airport through Taliban checkpoints, and the fact that the Taliban don't seem to be taking any step to interfere or obstruct this evacuation, shows that some kind of understanding between the United States and the Taliban has been reached. And that, by the way, suggests either that the United States is in direct negotiations with the Taliban to achieve or carry out this evacuation, or that someone, perhaps Pakistan, perhaps Saudi Arabia, conceivably the Russians, has perhaps mediated and brokered this understanding. Again, we don't know the full details. We will no doubt find them out shortly, but at the moment it's perhaps unwise to speculate on what kind of contacts the United States and the Taliban have with each other, or who is carrying out the negotiations, or who has helped the United States reach this understanding with the Taliban. It's also clear that embassies, Western embassies, are being evacuated from Kabul. The entire US embassy has apparently been relocated to Kabul airport, where it continues to function, though its entire purpose at the moment seems to be to process visas as people evacuating the city board on those planes heading back either to the United States or to wherever they're intended to go. And it seems that the other Western embassies, those of France, Canada, Germany, are apparently doing the same thing. The US ambassador was seen at the airport, apparently with the US flag furled up, carrying the flag himself in his arms, giving the impression of a captain leaving the sinking ship. And the British ambassador is apparently also in Kabul airport, and officials from the British embassy are also there, though it seems that the British have tried to maintain at least some kind of presence in their embassy in Kabul. One wonders for how much longer. The British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, meanwhile, has had a kind of breakdown on British television. He was being interviewed about the events in Kabul, and he struggled to hold back the tears. So all very dramatic scenes playing out in Kabul at the moment, very, in fact, distressing scenes in many cases. One should never underestimate or overlook the humanitarian aspects of this affair or doubt how distressing and terrible it can be for those people who are caught up in this. And of course, back in the United States, the person who is in theory in charge, the President of the United States himself, remains at his post in Camp David, where he addresses his officials by video link, speaking to them from an empty conference room. There is actually a photograph of him doing so. I think that was an extraordinarily ill-judged photograph, by the way. And all I will say about that is that he is very fortunate not to be his predecessor. If his predecessor, Donald Trump, had found himself in the identical situation to the one that the present incumbent, Joe Biden, finds himself in, I have no doubt at all that impeachment articles would have been drafted, and that impeachment would almost certainly have succeeded. Well, of course, in Joe Biden's case, he doesn't have to worry about that at all. He's coming under some criticism, but I suspect he probably calculates, or at least his advisors calculate, that he'll be able to see that off, and I'm sure he's right. Anyway, a disastrous day for the United States, a disastrous day for the neocon and neoliberal projects, a day which, unfortunately, despite all the denials, does indeed look like a fall of Saigon moment and an event which will be noted and which will circulate around the world. Certainly, I am sure this is not what the United States, what the administration in Washington envisaged or imagined would happen when that decision was made back in May to pull all the US troops out of the country. Now, I'm going to discuss and analyze in more detail in another video why this collapse has happened, a collapse which I was always sure would take place, but that is a subject which I'm going to discuss in more detail shortly. In the meantime, we are looking at a debacle. We are looking at a humiliating end to a project begun with so much triumphalism back in 2001, when the victory over the Taliban seemed to have been achieved with the greatest of ease, and a victory, by the way, which it is now clear was always incomplete and always conditional on events and actions which never subsequently followed. All I will say is that the neocon project, the neoliberal project of expanding democracy around the world, has encountered its most humiliating reverse so far, and I hope that this acts as a cautionary event for the American people, for the political class in the United States, that these ventures that the neocons always involve the United States in ultimately end badly and humiliatingly for the United States itself, and that it is best for the United States to follow a more conventional foreign policy and not get into the regime change game. And these long wars that the neocons always involve the United States in always end badly. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of this and about the situation in Afghanistan and in the United States now. What I will now discuss, and I'm going to do so fairly briefly because obviously this is a changing situation, is the diplomatic situation, because that ultimately is the one that is going to decide the future of the country, as well as the decisions obviously, which the Taliban makes in Afghanistan itself. And as I discussed in that video that I did yesterday, the one that was overtaken to a great extent by events, so far the Taliban have been abiding by the commitments they made, first and foremost, to the Russians in that clearly critical negotiation that took place several weeks ago in Moscow. They have so far acted with a measure of discipline and restraint, something which perhaps what might not have been expected of what is, after all, a militia. And there's no reports so far of any extreme violence or terrifying actions taking place in Kabul itself, though there have been attempts by some sections of the media in the West to pretend that such things are taking place. I have to say that I find that rather objectionable. It almost seems to me as if some mainstream news media outlets would almost want the Taliban to behave as it did back in the 1990s, because that would provide some kind of justification for the actions of the Western powers over the last 20 years. Anybody who really wishes peace in Afghanistan must hope that, on the contrary, the discipline that the Taliban are showing actually at the moment continues to prevail, and that some kind of peace is indeed restored to that unhappy country. Anyway, we will see how events turn out. But the diplomacy, as I said, goes on, and we've had a number of statements from the Russians and from the Chinese about events there. And the long and the short of it is that the Russians and the Chinese are holding out the possibility of recognition for the government that the Taliban forms, but that will be conditional upon the Taliban's good behavior, or at least good behavior as the Russians and the Chinese interpret it. And perhaps before we proceed in too much detail and discuss what the actual diplomatic moves are at the moment, it might be worthwhile recalling what those pledges that the Taliban made both to Moscow and to the Chinese in a subsequent trip to Tianjin are. They are briefly setting up an inclusive government that will bring together all the various communities that make up Afghanistan. That is important because the Russians and the Chinese doubt that the Taliban is going to be able to control Afghanistan for a prolonged period by itself, and they both see an inclusive government as necessary to bring peace and stability to the country, to the whole of the country, not just to the Pashtun areas where the Taliban are firmly in control. And as I've said, they will be pointing out to the Taliban that it is in its own interests to achieve that, if its real purpose in Afghanistan is to achieve peace there. And they have also pointed out to the Taliban that means that the Taliban must act with a certain measure of restraint, a return to the extreme fundamentalist Salafi policies that were pursued in Afghanistan in the 1990s, keeping women away from education, locking them up basically in their homes, imposing the most savage forms of Sharia law on the country. None of that is going to achieve peace in Afghanistan, because far too many people in Afghanistan, including people with guns, will see that as oppressive, and ultimately it will prove unsustainable, and it will only prolong the Afghan wars. And the other things that the Russians and the Chinese have been saying is that they want the Taliban to act on its pledges to keep Afghanistan free of Islamic terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and indeed to wage war upon those groups and the followers of those groups. And in the case of the Russians, they also want the Taliban to start taking steps to try to bring opium production and heroin trafficking in the country to an end. So those were the promises that the Russians extracted from the Taliban during that trip to Moscow. They would have impressed on the Taliban, as the Chinese would have done when they met with the Taliban in Tianjin a short time later, that it is in the Taliban's own interests to abide by these conditions, but that if the Taliban do abide by those conditions, then Afghanistan, the government that the Taliban establishes in Afghanistan, will receive diplomatic recognition from the Russians and from the Chinese, and the two countries will take steps to integrate Taliban in the Eurasian institutions that they are creating, the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, the Eurasian Economic Union of the Russians, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which the previous Taliban government, the previous Afghan government, that of President Ghani, said that Afghanistan would one day join. So that is, if you like, the bait that the Russians and the Chinese are holding out. That is also the advice that the Russians and the Chinese are giving. It will be up to the Taliban now to see whether they act on that advice and take that bait. And we must hope, for the sake of the people of Afghanistan, that they will do so. But I will say that the first signs are actually positive, because we learn from the Russian news agency TASS that the Russian ambassador to Kabul, and it's important to remember he is still in Kabul, as are all the embassy staff, is now in contact with the commander of the Taliban, presumed in Kabul itself. And this is the TASS dispatch, which I'm going to read in full. And it's based upon an interview given by Putin's envoy to Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, to Russia's Echo of Moscow radio station. And this is what TASS reports Kabulov as having said. Russian ambassador to Afghanistan, Dmitry Zhirnov, will meet on Tuesday with the coordinator of the leadership of the Taliban movement to discuss ensuring the security of the Russian embassy. Russian presidential envoy to Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, said in an interview with Echo of Moscow railway station. Our ambassador is in contact with representatives of the Taliban leadership. Tomorrow, as he told me just 10 minutes ago, he will meet with the coordinator from the Taliban leadership for ensuring security, including our embassy. The ambassador will discuss with the Taliban representative the details of the external protection of the diplomatic mission of the Russian Federation. Kabulov also stressed that the leadership, that's to say the Russian leadership, will make a decision on recognizing the regime of the Taliban movement depending on how responsibly they will govern the country. No one is going to hurry in this regard. The recognition or the non-recognition will depend on the behavior of the new authorities. We will watch closely how responsibly they will govern the country in the near future. Following these results, the Russian leadership will make the necessary consultations. And indeed, we learn more from RT, which has more about Kabulov's interview with Echo of Moscow. And we learn that Kabulov discounted that the idea that the United States is acting according to some kind of prearranged plan. He said, "I think those behind these kind of notions are trying to justify the failure of the Americans in Afghanistan and to make the case that this is a planned action. Instead, the belief had been that the US-trained Afghan army would be able to hold out against the Taliban for some time yet." I am sure, by the way, that this is absolutely true. And we also learn that the Russian embassy in Kabul, in London, has actually said that the events in Afghanistan show the objective reality is that Washington's comfortable position of US hegemony is receding into the past against the backdrop of the strengthening political positions of Russia and China. And that is, I think, fairly clear, and the position of the Russians about the future of Afghanistan and the future actions of the Taliban are discussed further by Kabulov in that interview with Echo of Moscow. And he says, according to our estimates, around 2/3 of this movement, including its top leadership, are committed to the idea of a political solution to the Afghan crisis. So he says that the leadership of the Taliban are committed to a political solution, one along the lines of what was agreed in Moscow. Perhaps a third might not be. Those are presumably the more militant fighters on the ground, and the Russians are waiting to see to what extent the Taliban is in a position to work as a coordinated, disciplined and single force, and is able to control that 1/3 who might be presumably more inclined to more extreme solutions. And for the Chinese position, we go now to Global Times, and we learn that the Chinese are also at the moment considering again a solution, a diplomatic solution to the situation in Afghanistan, and are looking for similar things from the Taliban to those that the Russians are looking for. And we've had the usual editorial from Global Times. And we read in that editorial the following things. The US has spent 20 years on its anti-terror war in Afghanistan, investing huge amount of resources in the country to support the Taliban, the Afghan government, and help train its troops. However, just a month or so after the quickened withdrawal of US troops, Afghanistan's military collapsed completely under the Taliban's fierce attacks. This was unthinkable for the US and the rest of the West, even beyond their most pessimistic predictions. The drastic change in Afghanistan's situation is undoubtedly a heavy blow to the United States. It declared the complete failure of US intent to reshape Afghanistan. That's a swipe at the neocons, by the way. In the meantime, the US's desperate withdrawal plan shows the unreliability of US commitments to its allies. When its interests require it to abandon allies, Washington will not hesitate to find every excuse to do so. A country as powerful as the United States could not defeat the Afghan Taliban, which received almost no aid from outside, even in 20 years. This defeat of the United States is a clearer demonstration of US impotence than the Vietnam War. The US is indeed like a paper tiger. A paper tiger, by the way, is a reference to a comment made about the United States long ago, back in the 1960s, by the former Chinese leader Mao Zedong. From another perspective, the US's defeat is even more humiliating than that of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Najibullah government in Kabul held out for more than 3 years after the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, whereas the anti-government guerrilla, where the anti-government guerrillas were heavily armed and supported by the United States. However, the Taliban defeated the US on its own. The Afghan government collapsed even before the United States had completed its troop withdrawal. By the way, that critical comparison between the collapse of the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan and the utter implosion of the US-backed regime in Afghanistan that Global Times is making is absolutely true. The Soviet-backed government survived for more than 3 years after the Soviet Union left. Indeed, it won victories against the Mujahideen rebels that the United States was backing during those 3 years. Whereas, as we said, the Afghan government and its army have just simply collapsed almost instantly the moment the United States announced its withdrawal. Anyway, the Global Times goes on now to discuss what China is expecting and what China will do. Such a change in Afghanistan will influence the regional geopolitical scene, bringing about quite some uncertainties. The Western media have been busy mentioning China when reporting Afghanistan. They even hype that the situation in Afghanistan has taken China to an awkward reality. But such a narrative is nothing but a logically confused attempt to appease their own feelings. The media in the United States and the West used to deny the existence of the terrorist group East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETHEREUM, portraying them as an excuse of China to engage in oppressive moves in Xinjiang. Now they have started to hype that the Taliban will support ETHEREUM after it gains power and thus impose a threat to the security of Xinjiang. In their narrative, China in particular has reasons to be concerned about the situation in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, China will indeed view the situation in Afghanistan, taking into consideration the stability of Xinjiang. But the Western media's narrative is unquestionably more than exaggerated. China's People's Liberation Army is heavily deployed around the Wuhan corridor, a key zone for China's counter-terrorism mission that links China and Afghanistan. Secessionists, extremists, and terrorist groups cannot even enter China from that corridor. Besides, after years of arduous governance, Xinjiang has uprooted extremism, making it harder for foreign forces to infiltrate the region. In reality, the main source of terrorist activities that were rampant in Xinjiang a few years ago was the United States and the West. The US and the West defended terrorists in Xinjiang in the name of human rights, beautified their terror acts as resistance against the Chinese regime, and instigated the three evils within Xinjiang ideologically. The West even turned a blind eye when international terror groups targeted China. The West's double standards are the biggest challenge to China's counter-terrorism efforts. China will rationally face the changing situation in Afghanistan. It will prevent the situation there from having a negative impact on Xinjiang, and at the same time evaluate the situation objectively. China will never jump into the trap Western opinion set up especially for China. The US's anti-terror war has failed. It is the US and the West that should bear the biggest challenge of the changing situation in Afghanistan. China is in a relatively favorable position. China has no will to fill the vacuum the US has left behind in Afghanistan. The principle of not interfering in the internal affairs of other countries is always guiding China's foreign policy. China will play a constructive role in helping Afghanistan achieve peace and engage in reconstruction. China's strategic kindness and policy stability will ensure that China always holds the initiative in the Afghan situation. Well, that's the way the Chinese like to talk. They blame the situation in Xinjiang on the West. They say that there is no possibility or threat to Xinjiang from Afghanistan because the Chinese People's Liberation Army has the situation fully under control. They make some sarcastic comments about how the United States and its allies denied a terrorism problem in Xinjiang and now looks forward to that terrorism problem escalating for China following the arrival of the Taliban in power. But ultimately, and if we put aside those kind of comments, the underlying message is the same as the one the Russians are giving. The Chinese will wait and see how the Taliban behaves in Afghanistan, if it behaves wisely, if it carries out the pledges that it made to Moscow and Beijing over the course of the negotiations in July, then China, like Russia, will indeed recognize the new government that is formed in Afghanistan, and like Russia, it will move forward and provide Afghanistan with the economic aid it needs to achieve peace and reconstruction. So that is the steps that the Russians and the Chinese are taking. They are waiting and seeing, and they are judging the Taliban on its actions. Up to now, as I have said, the Taliban seem to be heeding the advice that the Russians and the Chinese have given them. They seem to be working in the kind of direction that they promised the Russians and the Chinese that they would. And hopefully they will continue to do so, and peace and reconstruction will indeed be established in Afghanistan. If the Taliban, however, takes a different turn, then they will find the Russians and the Chinese hostile, and the Russians have moved troops to the border of Afghanistan. They've deployed more troops along the border in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan, making them able and ready to intervene. And as the Global Times editorial pointedly reminded the Taliban, the Chinese People's Liberation Army is also heavily deployed along Afghanistan's borders in the Wuhan corridor. So that is the proposal that both the Chinese and the Russians are making. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese cannot avoid making hay over the US's humiliation. They're pointing out what an unreliable ally the United States is. They're pointing out, too, the abject failure of its policies in Afghanistan. They're contrasting the failure of the US policies in Afghanistan with the relative success that the Soviet Union achieved whilst it was in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The government that the Soviet Union backed in Afghanistan survived and won battles, continued to win battles after the Soviet troops withdrew, and it only collapsed 3 years after that Soviet withdrawal, and as a consequence, by the way, of a cut-off of Soviet aid to Afghanistan and internal disputes within that government, specifically a coup launched against it by the Afghan general and subsequent warlord, General Dostum. So that is what the Russians and the Chinese are saying. And the Russians, who always take the initiative in these sort of diplomatic contacts, are now in direct contact with the Taliban leaders in Kabul itself. The initial contacts are to ensure protection for the Russian and presumably also other embassies, but ultimately and inevitably, those discussions, those negotiations that are taking place in Kabul at the moment between the Russian ambassador and the embassy and the Taliban officials in Kabul will eventually, no doubt, evolve into further and more complex talks. My own view is that the Russians and the Chinese are holding back and will no doubt continue to do so. If the Taliban continue to exercise discipline and restraint over the next few weeks, we will see Russia and China move to recognize their government as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, probably within a month, certainly at some point this year. So I don't think this question of diplomatic recognition will be delayed for very long, but that does, as I said, depend very much on what the Taliban now does. I think we could be, as I've said this many times, possibly, potentially on the brink of peace in Afghanistan. Obviously, it will not be a liberal parliamentary or presidential democracy such as exists in the West, but frankly, it was always utopian to think that it could ever be that. What is likely to emerge in Afghanistan, what will emerge in Afghanistan, is an Islamic Emirate. Well, the United States is in alliance with Islamic Emirates in the Gulf, and a country which is governed by some form of Sharia law. But it's perhaps important to say that the government in Afghanistan that was backed by the United States and which has now been overthrown, its formal title was the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and it too practiced a form of Sharia law. The question of Sharia law is one that is open to multiple interpretations. One can interpret it in the most extreme form, as the Taliban did in the 1990s, or one can perhaps take a more measured approach to it, which other Islamic states currently do. So it's for the Taliban to decide which way they go forward. They are the government now, they are the power, they will no doubt be able to form their Islamic Emirate, but what direction they take it is up to them. All we can wish for now is that they act with good sense and good judgment in their own interests, that they listen to the advice they're being given by the Chinese and the Russians, and no doubt by the Iranians too, in which case Afghanistan's future will not perhaps be exactly bright, but it will be brighter than it has been for the last 40 years. Well, as I said, rarely in history have such important decisions rested in the hands of an unruly militia. We will see what they do. In the meantime, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Please also remember to check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's own channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also look us up on our other platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, and SuperU, the new free speech platform SuperU, but also especially on the new giant platforms that are being created, Rumble and Locals, which are, I understand, now increasingly working together as one. And we've got an active and thriving community already going on Locals, and I'm now literally on the brink of starting to do my own live streams on Locals. I was about to do this, but of course the events have taken things over. I too am rushing to stay on top of the things that are going on, but I will be doing that very imminently and very soon. And so I look forward to you joining me on Locals, and also, and anyway, do sign up and look us up on that platform. And lastly, if you want to support our hardworking channel, and also specifically this channel, remember to go to our shop, buy the amazing things you will find there. our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our stickers, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please press the like button to this channel, to this video, if you've liked this video, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me on this program today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.